If Russia were a card player, it would probably have an unreadable poker face. The West has enjoyed an uneasy peace with their former ally turned enemy, which has been continually tested over the past century. The vast expanse of Russian territory is a place of mystery to most, and yet Russia has affected the course of history on multiple occasions. For good or bad, here are 5 times Russia has changed the course of history. Defeating Napoleon. In the early 1800s, Napoleon Bonaparte was well on his way to ruling the whole of Europe. Then, in 1807, Napoleon created the Duchy of Warsaw, an independent Polish state. After the Poles helped Napoleon to defeat Prussia, Napoleon established the duchy, which was made up of central Polish provinces that had been absorbed by Prussia when Prussia, Austria, and Russia had partitioned Poland in the late 1700s. Although the state was created from Prussian-ruled areas of Poland, Russian Tsar Alexander I thought it would encourage Polish nationalism, and in 1810 he started to resist Napoleon's rise. Napoleon decided to punish Russia for its lack of support and invaded on June 24, 1812. The French emperor amassed a huge army of an estimated 450,000 to 650,000 men that outnumbered the Russian military by around 3 to 1. Napoleon hoped to overwhelm Russia's forces for a quick victory, and on June 27th, it seemed he would achieve this when his forces easily captured Vilna. But the night of the success, an electrical storm and freezing hail and sleet killed many of Napoleon's forces, with others deserting in search of personal plunder and food. Napoleon was not deterred by this, declaring that the Russians must be pushed back into their ice. But the Russians used this to their advantage, letting Napoleon's forces advance only to find abandoned cities and burned crops. Many men began succumbing to the summer heat and lack of fresh supplies. They were plagued by typhus, other insect-borne diseases, and water-related illnesses like dysentery. The Russian soldiers did put up a fight, particularly at Borodino on September 7, 1812. Both sides suffered substantial losses before Russia withdrew. Triumphant, Napoleon's army marched into Moscow on September 14th to discover that most of the citizens had already evacuated. On October 19th, Napoleon was forced to retreat without receiving any communication from Alexander I. The Russian winter was rapidly approaching, and Napoleon knew his men could not survive if they stayed. Napoleon's Grand Army was debilitated, and most of the men had been lost. Attempting to flee south, they met a replenished Russian army at Maloyaroslavets, forcing them to turn back. The French military was undersupplied and faced constant attack from the rear. To make matters worse, the winter set in early, with driving snow and sub-zero temperatures. Then things went from bad to worse. The Russians attacked from the rear as the army approached the Berezina River. While most of the Grand Army managed to cross the freezing waters, the French were forced to burn their bridges, abandoning many soldiers and non-combatants. The retreat was no longer an organized force, but a desperate scrabble for survival. Fearful of a coup, Napoleon left the army and raced on to Paris. This defeat had far-reaching effects. Seeing that Napoleon was not undefeatable, Sweden, Prussia, and Austria rejoined the fight, allying with Russia and Great Britain against Napoleon. 3 years after his fateful attempt to invade Russia, Napoleon was defeated. Perhaps if Alexander I had agreed to let Napoleon marry into the Romanov family, or if Napoleon had left Russia alone and concentrated his efforts on England, we may be living in a vastly different world today. The Bolshevik Revolution. The Bolshevik Revolution was the second of 2 separate uprisings resulting from the incompetent and corrupt imperial government. In early 1917, workers began to strike, and women protesting food shortages took to the streets of Petrograd, modern-day St. Petersburg, during International Women's Day. More people joined the protests, and soon the crowd became an armed uprising. The police and Imperial Guard dispersed the crowd, with many demonstrators being shot down. But soon, the Imperial Guard joined the protesters, and it was clear that revolution was underway. Regiments of soldiers that marched towards the demonstrators suddenly joined them, sharing their weapons with the crowd. The governing powers and Tsar were slow to act, and the government feared that sending in more troops might add numbers to the ranks of the revolutionaries. Tsar Nicholas flat out refused to believe that his people were revolting against him. Despite its success, the revolution was disorganized, with no clear leader or goal. Amongst all the factions vying for power were the Bolsheviks, a seemingly innocuous bunch that included Vladimir Lenin and wanted socialist reform. After the initial revolution, Lenin felt that the groups likely to fill the power vacuum would continue to promote capitalism. He decided that the Bolsheviks would need to stage their own revolution to push their agenda of complete reform. After the first uprising, moderate parties took charge, but soon people with a leaning to the right started to try and restore discipline and order to Russia. After Lenin was accused of being a spy, many Bolsheviks were arrested, and Lenin went into hiding. The rest of the right culminated with an attempted coup from Russian General Laver Kornilov. The coup and suppression of the original revolutionary issues stirred up the people, who were readying themselves to fight the counter-revolutionary movement. The Bolsheviks took advantage of the situation, securing weapons sent to Petrograd to fight off Kornilov. Due to a renewed hatred for the ruling class, the All-Russian Executive Committee of Soviets was forced to choose Bolshevik members as emissaries. The Bolsheviks enjoyed increased support, and more people joined their movement. Soon, the Executive Committee was declared to be traitors to the revolutionary cause. Waves of violence against landowners swept through Russia, and distrust between soldiers and officers rendered the army pretty much useless. In the background, World War I was raging, and the Germans were coming closer to Russian territories. With Petrograd threatened, ministers tried to move the capital to Moscow and abandon the city. This action strengthened the Bolshevik cause, and the ministers were branded as traitors. With the plans to evacuate Petrograd in tatters, the ministers sent more troops to defend the city. The Bolsheviks then started to organize an attack on the government under the guise of protecting Petrograd from the Germans. When the leader of the provisional government, Alexander Kerensky, realized what was happening, it was too late. Try as he might, Kerensky could not stop the incremental takeover by the Bolsheviks. When Kerensky demanded that the Council of the Republic give him dictatorial powers to suppress the revolt, the committee refused. While they debated, the Bolsheviks quietly moved into the offices of the governmental staff and took control of the telegraph and telephone systems. After Kerensky tried to use Cossack troops against the Bolsheviks, Leon Trotsky declared, "We hope to establish a compromise without bloodshed, but now blood has been shed. There is only one way left, a ruthless fight." A new wave of fighting broke out, with the Bolsheviks winning supporters with slogans like "All power to the workers' Soviets" and promising peace, land, and bread. By the fall of 1917, the Bolsheviks were victorious, and communism was born. The rise of communism would have a far-reaching and profound effect on the world. Many nations that felt oppressed looked to communism as their salvation, and others would see it as a threat to capitalism and their way of life. World War II. Russia's role in affecting the course of World War II is undeniable. First, they helped start the war by allowing Hitler to train troops on Russian soil and agreeing to stage a two-pronged attack on Poland. One can only imagine what would have happened if Hitler had stayed a loyal ally of Russia, then known as the Soviet Union. Luckily for the rest of the world, Hitler despised communism and everything it stood for. He used the Russians for as long as they were useful and then decided to invade Russia. Well, we all know how that went for Napoleon, and it turns out that Russia's tactics had stayed pretty much the same and were just as effective as they had been in the past. The USSR suffered a devastating loss of life during World War II and lost more soldiers than every other Allied nation combined. But despite this, the Soviets were able to push the Nazi forces back into Germany, pursuing them to Berlin. In May 1945, the Red Army fought its way into Berlin and captured the city, cementing victory for the Allies. One of the most iconic images of World War II is a photograph taken on May 2, 1945, of Soviet soldiers raising their flag over the ruins of Reichstag. Without Russian support, perhaps World War II would not have started, but there is no doubt that their absence or continued alliance with the Nazis would have had a marked effect on the outcome of the conflict. Space travel. Following an uneasy alliance during the Second World War, the USSR and the US had their fair share of conflict in the form of the Cold War. While this was never a physical fight, the Cold War was a battle of propaganda. Essentially, the underlying factor behind the war was a disagreement in principles. In the capitalist corner was the US, while the USSR fought for communism. Both powers inherently distrusted the social system of the other, and they engaged in several races for technological supremacy. First was the nuclear arms race, which caused economic issues for both countries. Following a costly war, the atomic arms race took up valuable funds that may have otherwise been used for infrastructure and other domestic matters. On the plus side, a violent conflict was avoided. The next race to capture the respective government's attention and their budgets was the space race. After both powers had announced their intentions to send satellites into space, the USSR launched Sputnik on October 4, 1957. Far from ending the race, the first artificial satellite successfully placed in orbit only intensified the competition. The next month, the famous Russian dog Laika was blasted into orbit, becoming the first creature from planet Earth in space. Russia had come out of the blocks sprinting. The first U.S. satellite was launched 3 months after Laika's vessel, and the race intensified when, on April 9, 1959, NASA announced the intention to send men into space. Russia came back out swinging, sending the first human, Yuri Gagarin, into orbit on April 12, 1961. Unlike Laika, Gagarin was exhilarated by his time in space and safely returned to Earth. On February 20, 1962, John Glenn became the first American in orbit, only for the Russians to send the first woman, Valentina Tereshkova, into space the following year. She spent 71 hours orbiting the Earth, which was more time than all U.S. astronauts combined. In 1964, Russia announced its plan to travel to the Moon and launch the first multi-person spacecraft. The following year, Russian astronaut Alexei Leonov became the first person to go on a spacewalk. But America was not out yet. The same year Leonov made his spacewalk, the U.S. launched their multi-person spacecraft. Ed White completed a spacewalk, and they orchestrated the first orbital rendezvous. But Russia struck again in early 1966, making the first soft landing on the Moon with an uncrewed vessel called Luna 9. The frantic dash for the stars became fatal 10 years after the race began. In 1967, 3 American astronauts were killed during a launch pad test. Then, Vladimir Komarov became the first person to die returning from space when his parachutes failed to slow his descent from orbit. Nevertheless, the following year, the Russians successfully launched the first spacecraft to fly around the Moon and return safely to Earth, making a pair of tortoises the first Earthlings to voyage beyond the Moon. October 1968 marked the first flight of the U.S. Apollo program. In the following month, they achieved the first crewed flight around the Moon. In July 1969, America was on the brink of launching Apollo 11, which they hoped would land the first human on the Moon. Despite Russia's previous successes, and unbeknownst to the U.S., the Russian space program suffered a catastrophic setback. The Russians had constructed a secret moon rocket to gazump the Americans, but it had exploded at a remote launch site, destroying the launch pad. The Russians had neither the money nor resources to cross the finish line. On July 20, 1969, America landed the first humans on the Moon and brought them home safely. Some might say that space travel was always inevitable for the human race, but America's competition with Russia spurred it on. Perhaps without this rivalry, neither country would have undertaken such a risky endeavor, especially given the level of technology at the time. Invasion of Ukraine. Time will tell what effect the war in Ukraine will have on the world. For many in the West, it is the first time that war has seemed a little too close for comfort. The reality of this conflict has demonstrated the vulnerability of modern society and the limitations of seemingly powerful countries. The war already has far-reaching effects. In today's world, countries are heavily reliant on each other for resources. Ukraine is described as the world's breadbasket, producing around 30% of the world's sunflower oil. The European reliance on Russian oil and gas supplies has also come into sharp focus, with the EU seeking to end its dependence on such a politically volatile nation. The war's impact on geopolitics is yet to be seen. Still, many fear that the East and West will split again. This international tension has caused nations like Finland and Sweden, who have been neutral countries for around 70 years, to announce their intention to join NATO, bringing this military alliance back into the spotlight after nearly being relegated to the annals of history. What the future holds for Russia is unknown, but it seems that it is on the brink of another world-changing moment. How would you like to get a deeper understanding of history? impress your friends, and predict the future more accurately based on past events. If this sounds like something you might be into, then check out the brand new Captivating History Book Club by clicking the first link in the description. To learn more about Russia, check out our book, The Russian Empire, a captivating guide to the third largest empire in history, starting from Peter the Great to the Russian Revolution. It's available as an ebook, paperback, and audiobook. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button and subscribe for more videos like this.